they were talking about Taiwan being the next Ukraine. And they were actually stepping up training, providing asymmetrical, weapons and facilities necessary in the case that Taiwan would be attacked or invaded by the mainland. And looking at now how things have unfolded with Ukraine, what is your takeaway from the situation?
I mean, if I lived in Taiwan, if I was just an ordinary person in Taiwan, I would not want to make Taiwan into Ukraine. I would not want that. I would not want my land to be somebody else's battlefield. Taiwan is just within few hundred kilometers of the mainland. It's not that far away. It's absurd for countries that like Japan or the Koreas or Philippines. It's absurd for countries like that to have anxiety about their neighbors. They're going to have to live there. You can't lift the archipelago of the Philippines and move it to be the neighbor of California. The Philippines is going to be where the Philippines is. Japan is going to be where Japan is. They need to come to terms with their neighbors. That's absolutely clear. Taiwan is part of this great Chinese civilization, world, and so on. It's been very clear that there is a China. And this China is at some point going to unify. That has been very clear. We know that our boundaries, all of our Asian countries, were created in some ways by colonialism or by old history and so on. Hong Kong was seized in a colonial grab. And we know all these things. We know that it takes a difficult kind of process to reconstruct our national territories. We know that. When the Soviet Union fell apart, Ukraine broke away and became a separate country. But parts of Ukraine were Russian speaking. They had been part of the Russian world. It was surprising that in 1991 there was less violence. These countries just broke apart. People were exhausted by the collapse of the Soviet Union. We have to come to terms with the fact that we live where we live. So the last thing you want is for violence to substitute for understanding. Taiwan is part of China. That's just a fact of history. It's a fact of culture, civilization, and so on. The peoples are going to have to deal with how they engage each other. But for Taiwan to be used by the United States, its allies, as a bargaining chip to try and harass China, I think is very unfortunate, because that's really what it is. I mean, let's not mislead ourselves. The people in the United States are not worried about the welfare of the Chinese people in Taiwan. They are not thinking every day, what's happening to the Chinese people in Taiwan? And we know that because US high officials have said, if the mainland tries to incorporate Taiwan, then we are going to bomb the factories. They have said that. They have said that openly. They will sabotage the factories. But that's outstanding. That means you don't care about the people that live in Taiwan. You don't care about them. You're more interested in who controls things. So in that sense, one shouldn't allow oneself to become a pawn of somebody else's ambitions. The Ukrainians, unfortunately, became a pawn for European and US ambitions to essentially what they said was weaken Russia. Ukraine is going to live next to China. I think the people...
You mean the province of Taiwan is going to live next to the mainland? Yeah, will always be there?
Exactly. I mean, no. The province of Taiwan is always going to be part of China. Ukraine as a country is going to be next to Russia. I mean, the geography has to determine our attitude to our neighbors. India and Pakistan are always going to live next to each other. They have to come to terms with each other. You can't have a border dispute that goes on generation after generation after generation. These countries are going to have to sort it out. Same with India and China. Have to sort out a minor border difference.
The US has actually been flip-flopping very smartly, their so-called, their position on the One China issue, and now they're trying to play with the word One China policy instead of One China principle to distance itself from China's position. In the beginning, when it wanted to to use China against the former Soviet Union, they came to China and they got soft on the Taiwan issue, right? So they could establish diplomatic relations with China. But then when it was in their interest, later they start flipping again. They say, oh, the status of Taiwan is indeterminate, meaning I'm not sure whether it's part of China. You say, and I heard it, I take note of it. But then when relation was good between the United States and China in terms of economic globalization and so on and so forth, so Taiwan was kept under, don't do much, don't cause trouble. And now when China is rising, seen as a threat, this Taiwan indeterminate status thing is rearing its ugly head. What is your observation of this kind of flip-flopping in China policy?
There's no principle involved here. I mean, this is a power game. When the question of Hong Kong was on the table, for many years, nobody talked about democracy in Hong Kong when it was under British rule. Nobody talked about democracy. But when Hong Kong, after the obligation of the treaty was transferred to China, BBC started talking about democracy in Hong Kong every day, human rights. But for 100 years, you had control over Hong Kong. There was no democracy there. In fact, the last Governor General of Hong Kong would be on BBC every night talking about democracy. You were the dictator of Hong Kong. You never talked about democracy when you were the dictator. And I use the word dictator deliberately. He was effectively the viceroy. He controlled everything. This is not a point of principle. This is a power game. This is a dispute over power. Somehow it's acceptable for Donald Trump to say, we'll annex Greenland. That's an acceptable thing to say. Many people found it peculiar, but he said it. He's the US president. We'll just annex Greenland. That's okay. But if China says, well, we are one China and Taiwan is a province, that's somehow expansionary and aggressive. This is a curiosity. The United States conducted an illegal war against the Iraqi people. Illegal, again, not by my judgment, but the United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan told BBC it's an illegal war. That's an illegal war. You went aggressively and took over a foreign country. Nobody has paid the price for that. But here there's a dispute about the borders of a country, whether Taiwan is part of China or not. That's a border issue. What is the territorial limits of the country? It's not an aggressive act against a foreign country, and yet they have made it into one of the biggest foreign policy challenges of our time. It's pretty extraordinary how these are not matters of principle. These are matters of power. If it was a matter of principle, then the Trump administration, which is saying, well, we're just going to annex Greenland, should have no problem with other countries wanting to annex places. But obviously, it's not a matter of principle. This is a matter of power, and it has to be understood like that.
And there is this effort, it seems to be a coordinated effort between think tanks and media and the US government to kind of come up with a coordinated narrative about the status of Taiwan or certain UN resolutions which grant China's UN seat to the PRC instead of those of Taiwan. How do you look at the kind of interplay between the media, the think tank experts, and the policy?
Well, it's interesting because with the shutting down or suspension of USAID, a big funder of various organizations around the world, we suddenly heard people say, oh my goodness, my funding from the US government has disappeared. Number of these think tanks are basically in an ecology with media, with intelligence and so on. I don't want to sound like a crazy person, but just to be quite clear, a lot of people may not know that the Atlantic Council, for instance, in the United States, is the think tank of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's NATO's think tank, and that's why it's called the Atlantic Council. These are not independent bodies. These are bodies related to defense, they are related to military pacts and so on. The Council on Foreign Relations is not an independent body. It's deeply implicated with the US State Department. These are talking points that circulate and travel. Obviously, there are independent people who work there who have different opinions and judgments. It's not a conspiracy, but they are very closely tied to places of power within the United States. And also, there's a culture of thought that we shouldn't underestimate. People, have a feeling that the US government is benevolent and other governments are malevolent. that you can't trust the government in this country or that country, but you can trust the US government. This exceptionalist argument is very much in play. So I'm not surprised when there's, whatever one calls it, talking points, cultural congruity, where people seem to agree with each other. But certainly, on the question of China, there are certain clarities that you can see in these sections where people talk about how Beijing cannot be trusted. Now, this is interesting because this comes and goes. Sometimes they say, well, Beijing is a good partner. Sometimes they say Beijing can't be trusted. Again, on what basis are you saying it's a good partner or it can't be trusted? It's on the basis of whether Beijing is doing what Washington says. When Beijing does what Washington says, then Beijing is a good partner. When Beijing doesn't do what Washington says, Beijing cannot be trusted. I think that's the principle at play, not what's happening in Beijing.